what support comes from the EHCP itself versus
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the final meeting of the Schools Forum for this academic year, 2024-2025. I'll be your host for the evening, like a radio DJ. But yes, thank you so much for turning up in person, and for those of you online, thank you so much for being here. Let's run through the agenda here. First is apologies for absence and any substitutions. Cornelia, are you all right to read those out, please?
Yes, we have apologies, first of all, from Robert South, who's the Strategic Director for Children's Services, and Julie Lewis is substituting for him. And then from the maintained primary schools, we have apologies from Helen Rye, Wendy Smith, and David Bone. From the maintained high schools, we have apologies from Marion Budd. And from the academies, we have apologies from Tony George and Roisin Walsh. And from the councillors, we have apologies from Councillor Fadima Mohammed.
Thank you. And I just want to double check that we're quoted. I believe 12 is that the appropriate number?
Yes, members are encouraged to attend in person. Attendance in person is preferable. And actually, just to add about the apologies, we have apologies for lateness from Louise Troy. She'll be joining in about half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Cornelia. Before we move on to the urgent matters, I think just as we're going through the list of members, it's important that we recognize new members to the forum. So re-elected, who we've known for many years, is Councillor Sharma, so welcome back. New to the forum, Councillor Mohammed, who is unfortunately unable to attend tonight, but we welcome you in spirit, Councillor Mohammed, and Councillor Oxley. Welcome to the Schools Forum, and we look forward to working with you. The next is any urgent matters, online or in the room? Nope. Matters to be considered in private, online or in the room? Nope. Declarations of interest? Anything changed for anyone? Nope. So let's move on to minutes of the last meeting. I'm just going to go through them with the page number that they're listed on in our agenda. So please do stop me if we get to a page and there's anything to edit, amend, or comment on. So page 3 of the minutes, page 4, page 5, 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, and page 10. No. So we will take the minutes then as read and approved, and I will sign a copy that is here for you. There we go. Membership. It's showing on our list 2 vacancies. I believe one of the vacancies is not completely relevant to the forum, and that's representative of non-maintained SEND providers, either because we don't have any or we have maybe a very small number that are not reflective of the wider population. Is that correct, Kim?
Yeah, so the representative on forum is a representation of non-maintained SEND providers. So you've got, when we have independent providers and we have non-maintained providers, which are a slightly different category. That's the representation here, and we currently don't have any schools that are non-maintained SEND providers in Ealing, and we only have a small number of children in other schools, so there's probably not anyone appropriate at the moment to fill that vacancy. So that's a standing vacancy at the moment.
And the PVI nursery provider, am I right in thinking that that's a conversation happening at the local authority level? It's not necessarily an elected role, it's a different style of role?
Yep, so Susan Dillons was the previous PVI nursery representative, and her term of office came to an end earlier this month, I think, or last month. And yeah, that's a conversation happening at the moment at the local authority with around the process for filling that vacancy in the PVI sector.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. That's probably where I should welcome the new members, but I've done that already. I think should be at the top of the agenda. The most important thing are people. Okay, so now we're on to the forum reports. Can I ask if it's all right with you, Kim? Are we all right to just rearrange these slightly and deal with the things that the forum needs to vote on and agree first? Is that possible, or is it not easy to do that?
It's not really going to make sense for
Okay.
because recommendation 1 kind of informs
That's fine.
the recommendation 2, and then recommendation 3 kind of informs
Sure.
the decision for
Okay, well, let's
recommendation
stick
4.
to the order then. We'll stick to the order, and yes, Kim, thank you.
Okay. Hi everyone. So just to sum in summary, the July meeting report covers, so it provides a summary of the outturn position for the LA maintained schools and for the dedicated school grant for 24-25, and highlights issues that related to funding that Forum will need to consider as part of the early years high needs schools and central school services budgets for 25-26 and looking forward into 26-27. So recommendations. The first recommendation is that Forum members note the level of school balances and deficit agreements of positions as at the 31st of March 2025. So the detail of this is within Appendix 1 and pages 14 and 15 of the report. So just to pick up the key points on this, so maintained school balances provisionally totaled just over 13 million at the end of March 25. Still a provisional position at this point because there are a couple of schools where that position was still being finalised at the point of the report being submitted, but we don't expect any major changes and the majority are finalised. So that's a decrease of 1.25 million on the previous year and has come down from just over 20 million 3 years ago. So of the 75 Ealing maintained schools, 83% are in a surplus, so 62 schools, of which 32 of them increased their balances last year, including 3 schools moving from a deficit position into a surplus position, which is always a positive thing that schools moving in that direction. And then 30 schools decreased their balances, so around half and half in terms of increasing and decreasing balances among that group. So the full detail of those are shown in Appendix 1. And then in terms of deficits, there are 13 schools in deficit at the end of 24-25. And so that compares to 12 the previous year. There have been some, say 3 schools coming out of deficit, and so 4 new schools that were previously in surplus who've fallen into deficit position. So it's 2 nursery schools, 7 primary schools, 1 special school and 3 high schools are the schools that are in deficit. So those deficits in total amount to just under 5 million. And that's increased from just over 3 million at the end of 23-24. And they range from deficit of around 50,000 to 1.1 million in the school with the largest deficit. Schools with deficits are expected to develop a deficit recovery plan and work to achieve a balanced budget and returning to a surplus position within a 3-year period. And we have sort of robust monitoring requirements and offer support to schools that fall into that position. And all schools, as part of their May budget setting, are now required to submit a 3-year budget plan. So as well as looking at the 1-year budgets, we're also reviewing the 3-year budgets and to risk assessment and where appropriate, following up with schools. And we'll continue to, as we have done in the last few years, request an in-year forecast from all schools to enable us to pick up the position at that stage and work with any schools where that position is shifting through the year. So the recommendation around that is just noting the level of balances around that and the detail in Appendix 1.
Any questions about the first item to note? Councillor Sharma. Sorry, Ian, can you, if you put your hand up, I'll come to you.
Yeah, sure.
Councillor Sharma.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask what support is in place for the 13 schools in deficit, and are we confident that these schools can recover within the 3-year time frame that you mentioned? Thank you.
Yeah, so as a local authority, it's a statutory duty around supporting those schools. So we're meeting with those schools, the head teachers and chair governors, and working with them to support them in developing a deficit recovery plan. And those schools are at various stages. So some of those schools have a deficit recovery plan in place that brings them back into a surplus position. Others are kind of at the position where they've sort of stabilised in year, but are working on a longer term plan to recover the deficit. And then some of those schools are not yet in a position where they're able to set out a plan that brings them back into a surplus position. So we're working with those schools. There are a range of different supports. I think in the report I mentioned around the free school resource management advisor. So that's a DfE programme where and we kind of broker for that arrangement for schools who are either in deficit or at risk of falling into deficit, and think that would be helpful. So we've got another one of our schools has a deployment starting in a couple of weeks, and we've got another couple of schools where we've requested a deployment for the early in the autumn term around that. So yeah.
Thank you. Ian, did you want to come in now and ask your question? Sorry about that.
I was just going to ask Kim if there was any sort of consistency into the causes of why schools do fall into deficit. Obviously, this is a bit close to my heart, given my particular representation, because it can be quite difficult, I think, to say, let's just have a 3-year plan and it'll resolve itself. I think the comment Councillor Sharma was spot on. How certain can we be? Everyone, I'm sure, is making good steps towards addressing it. Nobody wants to be in deficit, but are there any consistent factors, or is it very much school by school?
It does vary. So some of those schools are schools that have experienced falling rolls and therefore reducing budgets. There are other schools within that who are full, and so it's the causes are not to do with that kind of falling roll, falling budgets, but there are different causes around that. I mean, varying from kind of staffing pressures and high needs pressures come up a lot in those kind of conversations. But yeah, some of the schools in deficit now are some of our largest schools, as well as some of our sort of smallest schools. So there isn't a sort of consistent pattern as to sort of the causes of that. It varies quite considerably.
Thanks, Kim.
Hi, can
Thank
I ask,
Go on.
when you were mentioning this deficit recovery plan, what are some of the strategies that schools use? I mean, I know they're not consistent. What are one of the key strategies that schools use? I mean, of course, that's like dropping staff, or what are they, just to kind of use?
So the vast majority of school budgets are spent on staffing, and so proactive management of your kind of staff recruitment and retention, and avoiding reorganisations where you can through kind of natural turnover, etc. Thinking about staff deployment, and the SEND provision map is often quite a key aspect in terms of the level of teaching assistant resource associated with the SEND provision map in the school. And then more broadly, thinking about kind of the asset refresh in school and thinking about how that's spread over time. So IT and site maintenance, and then the contracts. So having a really thorough look at the contractual arrangements, making sure they're following really robust kind of procurement exercises and competitions to get best value and best price. So it will be a combination of all of those things, but in some schools it's kind of focused to a greater or lesser degree depending on their current operating model. So some schools have 70-odd% staffing, other schools have 80, special schools 90-odd%. So it does vary, but a lot of it is around staffing, and some of the smaller schools struggle in terms of having a long-term teaching workforce that move through the grades and have a large number of UPS teachers, and so some of it's kind of quite structured in relation to how pay works for those schools.
Thank you. Any other questions? Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so recommendation 2 is around the clawback mechanism. So a decision for forum at this meeting is about whether to apply the balance control or mechanism or clawback mechanism. And so the recommendation is that forum agree the clawback mechanism where schools have excessive increasing sepsis as recommended in option 1. So that's paragraph 14, the options around that. So we've included an extract from the scheme for financing schools. So it says appendix 1 there, but it's not, it's appendix 2. Which sets out the detail of how the mechanism works, which has not changed from the previous years. So that's the same mechanism that Forum have agreed in previous years around. So it's not just around schools who are over the balance control limit, but it's schools that have excessive increasing over a 3-year period. That's over a 3-year period. So last year Forum supported a decision to apply the mechanism. And we ended up taking forward the clawback mechanism for one school of £3,000. So it's a small amount for one school. There were a number of other schools in scope, but the review of the balance forms and the adjustments that were made based on that brought those out of scope. So it's only one school that we took the clawback forward from following the forum decision. That school continues to have a balance above the balance control mechanism this year, but the balance reduced this year, so they wouldn't be in scope for clawback. The mechanism uses the 3-year period. So schools who've reduced over one or both for the past 2 financial years, or who weren't above the mechanism last year, wouldn't be considered for clawback. So there are 4 schools potentially in scope for this year: 2 primary, 1 high, 1 special, and they're set out in appendix 3. And so the option that Schools Forum members are asked to consider is to apply a clawback mechanism, agreeing that the resultant clawback fund can be used to support high needs pressures and or other potential pressures related to future school organisation changes, using the same mechanism set out in previous years, considering only those schools that have the increasing excess balances over the 3-year period, so it's 2 consecutive years. That could result in a clawback of up to £20,000, it's 23,000. But that amount could change following the review of the balance forms, which would take place following a decision if Forum decided to take that forward. So the decision is effectively either to take it forward or to not apply the clawback mechanism this year.
Any comments about this before we vote on this matter? Just
I mean, it's actually something Jonathan Bailey touched on, the same point that I had in the clarification meeting. It seems like a very elaborate process, which must involve a lot of time at schools for officers to do, for you to then produce a report and some analysis, for 25 people to get in a room and discuss, and then to claw back only a few percentage points of an excess, which is well in excess of what you've already said is a prudent amount that people should budget to. So I'm really struggling to understand why the clawback isn't closer to 100% rather than a few percent. And it seems to me that would preserve the incentives point that I think is it tomorrow. I can't read your name mentioned. And it would then be actually a material amount. I guess I think I calculated it might be 400 grand or something, which you could put towards high needs. And so I'm bewildered why we would stick with this tiny little percentage. And actually, if that's the alternative, then I would say, well, forget all this bureaucracy. Go for option 2 and don't charge it.
So the decision around the mechanism itself was one that Forum take in the April meeting as part of agreeing the scheme for financing schools. So the actual sort of makeup of the mechanism, so the idea of focusing on those schools with excessive increasing sepsis and clawing back the incremental amounts that the relatively small incremental amounts that the mechanism currently does, was a decision that was consulted on. It was actually consulted in the last 2 school consultations with all schools, and the consensus of schools agreed to continue to keep with the existing mechanism. We would have another chance to go out to consultation on a change to the mechanism. for next year in the autumn and agree that moving forward in the next April meeting, if we were minded to make a change. Although part of what we've discussed previously is that actually if we were going to make a material change to the mechanism, you would want to give schools lead-in time for that, so they have time to respond to it, rather than change it in this financial year for next financial year, for example. But this decision of today's meeting is around taking forward the clawback mechanism, not whether we increase those amounts or not. That would be a decision for a future meeting. The intention of the clawback mechanism has always been to act as a deterrent rather than to aim to try and claw back large sums of money from schools. So to encourage schools to spend the budgets that they have on the children that are in their schools, rather than as an intention to claw back large amounts of money. Quite a lot of boroughs don't have a clawback mechanism or don't apply a clawback mechanism each year. So some other, thinking from my London colleagues, quite a lot of them don't have a mechanism, but we've had this mechanism for 4 years now.
I think, sorry.
Ian, sorry,
there
yeah.
There are people ahead of me.
Yes, I'll come to you. Jamie and then Councillor Sharma, please.
Mine will be quick because I was going to say both things that Kim just summed up with at the end, is that the decision today isn't to make the decision about what the mechanism should be, it's whether we apply it or not. And we're going to have to, if we want to change the mechanism, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we have to have that at a different meeting so that when it comes around to this time next year, we're saying about whether we apply it or not. So today, unfortunately, is just whether we apply it or not. And then the second one is that as a school leader, I think that the point is we don't want to penalise schools, but we want them spending their money on their children. So it's not about making money for the forum or making money for the high needs block. It's about the money that is allocated to our children in our schools should be spent on our children in our schools. And if the mechanism can make schools do that, that's the point of it. And I'm also speaking as the only one school that had a clawback last year. It certainly made us think about it, and when we were planning, we were like, right, we need to commit some funds to some things and spend them on the children rather than be too risk averse, because my governors would definitely hold back all the money they could and have 25% reserves if they could, and not spend them on the children, which isn't the right thing to do. And it's made us spend money on our children, which is the right thing. So for us, it has worked, because it's forced those conversations. So I think, it's good in the future to have discussions about what the percentages are. Are they nearer 100%? Are we more whatever about it? But actually today it's a bit of a moot point really, because we just got to say, do we go ahead with it? And I would say yes, we do go ahead with it, because we did it last year when it was me. And
thanks, Jamie. Councillor Sharma and then Ian, please.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is, how will clawed back funds be targeted to best support areas of greatest need? And will they go directly to mitigate the high needs deficit or support vulnerable schools?
Yeah, so in the context of the overall high needs block, it's a very marginal value. As you saw last year, that the initial value was reduced to a very small value. So the report sets out that it would be used against high needs block commitments, which is to support vulnerable young people. So yes, it would be used for that purpose. In the scheme of things, it's not a massively material amount, which has already been discussed. Thanks.
Thanks, tomorrow. Ian?
Yeah, I think for me it was the point Tamara made before, that actually what it's done, and I think Jamie's just reiterated it, that what it makes schools do is think about spending the money they've got and not storing it up. And for that reason alone, it's good to have this mechanism. I've raised over many years whether it should be a bit more, as has also been discussed today, but it really isn't about trying to bring it back in and then reallocate. It is about, as Jamie says, to get schools to spend it and not save it for 2 years, 3 years down the line. So I would support proceeding on the current basis, and if we want to consider a marginal change to it going forward, then so be it.
Thanks, Ian. Anybody else? Any comments? No, I mean, I can't help but cringe every time I see this every year. And, you know, Councillor Oxley, you're singing from the same hymn sheet as me. What on earth are we playing out with this? However, it's not for this meeting. But can we please note that we need to make sure it's on the items to be discussed at the meeting that is appropriate, because I think the feeling in the room is different than maybe it was 3 years ago or 4 years ago when, you know, we were having some heated debate about this. But I think that would be healthy. Is there any more comment on whether or not we support this? Kate? Oh yeah, make sure your mic's on just for the people online.
I've got no skin in this game, but there is a sense in which you need to, I think, analyse whether it's actually having the effect you want. I mean, you've had testimony from Jamie saying it concentrated their minds, but you haven't really got evidence to show whether all the palaver you go through in producing this report and the kind of work that goes into it, which probably is more than £23,000 worth of work. All right, but it's, you know, it's having the desired effect. And I would have thought if you're going to make an in principle decision, you ought to have much more evidence to say if the schools are experiencing clawback actually are incentivised to be on their game, then it's worth it. But if they aren't, then this is rather a long exercise to achieve the result you want. I'm grateful for Jamie's testimony that it might be the case that it hasn't the desired effect, but I think you need an in principle question because it's a long way round to get to not very little otherwise.
Yeah, so I suppose the evidence that we do have is that the schools that have experienced clawback have then not continued to increase their surpluses the following year. So we haven't had, in the years where we've had clawback, we haven't had any schools who've been subject to clawback 1 year and then been subject to clawback again the following year, having increased their surpluses again. And then I guess the other piece of evidence we have is around the overall scale of the balances and the reduction. So part of the reason for having a balance control mechanism was around the size of the maintained school balances, and those have come down year on year over the past 3 years. So I suppose that's the evidence we have that it is having some of that desired impact. I think if we, I mean, we're happy to include a question about this again on the consultation. I think what we need back is the views of the wider school community on that, because I can assure you any schools that are subject to clawback don't think these are small amounts of money from the conversations they have back with us. So I think that both encouraging responses to the consultation in the autumn term, but also having those conversations at quadrant and heads meetings ahead of, like, both to encourage the responses, but also to garner the views to inform a discussion around that before we agree what it is that we want to include in the scheme for financing schools for future years.
Thanks, Kim. Yes, Ian.
This is a very quick one.
Go for it.
The other thing is that, as Kim mentioned, we do give every school an opportunity to explain their sort of medium-term plan as to why they may be in a situation where they appear to fall within it. And I think a lot of schools end up dropping out of being in the clawback mechanism as a result. So I don't think it arguably it's not quite onerous enough, but I don't think schools could query that they're being over. I'm looking at the numbers here. Their budgets compared to the clawback we're talking about is massive. The clawback's tiny. I think we give them every opportunity, and it's quite right that we do.
Thank you, Ian. Any other comment directly about whether or not you would support or not option 1 or 2? No? Okay. So I think it is time to probably move to whether or not we would like option 1 or option 2 of the clawback mechanism. Option 1 obviously being to apply the clawback mechanism, option 2 to not apply the clawback mechanism. So if you are in favor of option 1, do you want to give a little show of hands? This is, sorry, maintained schools. Is it maintained schools only? Sorry, I should have made that clear at the beginning. This is a maintained schools decision. I don't believe actually there are any. Yes, sorry, Mia, I didn't see your hand.
I think it's a hand.
Oh, a voting hand, wonderful.
You're maintained.
Yeah.
Yes,
So yeah, so it includes foundation schools, community schools,
Okay.
and VA schools.
so can you just keep your hand up so Cornelia can count, please? Sorry.
In favor of 6.
Yeah.
Of option 4 or 9. 4 and 9.
So that's 10. Yes,
For option 1.
yes.
Okay.
And for option 2, no clawback. 1, 2, 2. Option 1 has been successful. Thank you very much for the conversation and discussion. Let's move on to the next bit.
Okay, so recommendation 3 is to note the DSG outturn for 24-25. So the dedicated school grant outturn across the 4 blocks of the dedicated school grant. So schools block, central school services block, early years block, and the high needs block. So these are set out on page 17 of the report. So the overspend on the dedicated school grant across the 4 blocks this year was just over 3.7 million. And table 1 outlines the overspends and underspends by block. So the schools block was overspent by just over £500,000. The central schools services block was spent to the allocations, the variance in that. The high needs block was overspent by 5.5 million, and the early years block was underspent by 2.2 million. Then the table 2 sets out the use of reserves from the previous year. So the decision made by Forum this time last year was that those the small reserves from last year could be spent on either spent on high needs block pressures or spent on pressures on the growth fund around school organisation changes. So the use of reserves column in table 2 is showing the small surpluses on the central school services block and early years block, then being applied to the schools block to cover the overspend on the growth fund for last year. And then bringing back to the overall closing position, which is a cumulative, brings us to a DSG overall reserve or overall deficit position of 5.6 million at the end of March 25. So the high needs deficit, I think we talked at length last meeting around the high needs deficit and the high needs deficit recovery plan around that. The in-year deficit on the schools block results primarily from pressure on the growth fund. So there was both growth funding for 2 secondary schools to ensure sufficient places to meet demand as the secondary year groups moved through, but also bulge class funding to 2 primary schools in the Acton planning area, where in a different to elsewhere in the borough, where we've seen pressures and needed additional places to enable reasonable offers to children in that area of the borough. So that's the kind of the reason for the pressure. As I say, some of that's been offset through the use of reserves from last year. SEPs on the early years block flows partly from unused contingency. So for members to remember, we kept just over £1 million of contingency on the early years block to sort of provide a contingency and buffer around the uncertainty over numbers during the rollout of the new childcare entitlement, and also around the sort of methodology the government used for retrospectively adjusting the local authority grant based on actual take-up. And partly from differences between the estimated take-up of entitlement at budget setting and estimated take-up of supplement funding and what the actual eligible numbers were. So going forward, there's a few things kind of mitigating that those underspends moving forward. So the approach to estimating supplement funding was reviewed and revised in setting the 25-26 early years funding formula. And the DfE have also announced a move to funding local authorities based on termly headcounts rather than on annual headcounts and retrospectively adjusting. So that should make it easier moving forward and less uncertainty moving forward around those funding arrangements. So that underspend on the early years block carries forward into the 25-26 financial year. And then recommendation 4 is the decision for Forum. So recommendation 4 is around asking Forum to agree to retain the early years block reserves to manage, so similar to the request from last year, to manage high needs block pressures and enable additional early intervention support and or to manage the commitments against the growth fund and any other pressures related to future school organisation changes.
Thanks, Kim. Question or comment on the dedicated schools grant outturn for 24-25 or the agreement to retain the early years block surplus and shift that to high needs? Question, comment, concern, celebration. Okay, so why don't we move straight away then to point 4, which is to agree to retain the early years block dedicated school reserve to manage the high needs block deficits.
Yeah, so both to manage the high needs block deficit and enable additional early intervention support, or to manage any pressures there are against the growth fund, which is where we ended up using that small amount of reserve for last year.
Vanessa?
Where can we see a map of the early intervention that's taking place? Like, because you were talking earlier on about schools taking on extra classes. Like, I would like to see a map of exactly how this looks, because we're talking about it, but I don't know where to go and find it, actually see what it's like, because I just would like to see how it's landing and what's being done.
Mara?
Thanks, Vanessa. So in terms of early intervention and outreach across SEN, is that the question, Vanessa? Yeah, so the place where that is kind of overseen is through the SEN and Inclusion Committee and through the governance around the SEN strategy. So that's not typically the type of information that would come here. It's funded from the centrally retained high needs block. And so we can ask Aretha to share something around that with you, but that would be the usual route in terms of shaping and sharing the information around the outreach offer. So through the SEN governance rather than through the forum governance. Yeah.
Thank you. Is that all right, Vanessa?
I just had one more question, was connected to what you said earlier on. So you said that the governments are going to be looking at how with pupil numbers and funding local authorities according to how many pupils on a termly basis, and that feeds through to us as well then. So would our numbers be adjusted and not be just census October? So if our numbers are fluctuating, money is coming to us.
So
as well.
So this is for early years, not for children from reception upwards. Schools are and PVIs and nurseries are already funded on a monthly basis, so already funded for monthly headcounts. The thing that's changing is how the government allocate the block. So the block will that we receive, that is then divvied out to schools and providers, would be funded on a termly headcounts, whereas at the moment it's funded on the January headcounts, and there's sort of estimates and adjustments made moving forward. So it wouldn't make any change to how schools are funded. Schools are already funded on a and PVIs are already funded on a monthly basis based on actual numbers.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I was thinking about like year 1 to 6.
Yeah, no. So reception to year 6 will remain funded based on the October census. So there's no planned changes to that. The thing that it does do for early years is potentially take away some of the uncertainty around the numbers, which is what I was saying about potentially it's less likely to lead to kind of unused contingency and purposes in future years where there's more certainty around some of that.
Thanks, Kim. Any other comment or question before we move to agree or not? No? Why don't we just we'll do it backwards, maybe for ease. If you do not agree that we should retain the early years block to manage some of the things Kim has mentioned, speak now. No? Okay, so we can take that as agreed. Thank you. Point 5.
Okay, so moving to recommendation 5. So this is the recommendation to note the summary of the DSG funding decisions to be made for, and it should say there 26-27, so that's just a correction, and provide feedback on these services to assist in the local authorities planning. So the areas we're referring to are set out in Appendix 4. So it's the dedelegations in respect to services to maintain schools, the education functions, so those retained duties in relation to maintain schools, the essentially retained budget, so the duties that the local authority have for all schools, and the allocation of the central services, school services block, the historic commitments, which are a part of the central school services block. Yeah, so those areas. The detail of this in the report is set out on pages, gets right, 18 to 21. And so there's a range of bits of information here around those kind of funding decisions. And some of the information we know already about the 26-27. So if I just run through those, and we'll take any kind of feedback afterwards. So the local authority will, as usual, formally consult schools in the autumn on the funding arrangements for the following financial year. So we will aim to circulate a draft of the consultation for the end of term to forum members for comments. But what we're asking now is to consider some of the key decisions around that. So it's running through the different areas. So schools block funding. This year, the government have now confirmed, since I wrote the report, that we're not going to get the detail of the schools operational guide, the detail of the DSG, the schools block allocations until the autumn term. So as we did last year, we will need to be going out to consultation on principles rather than actual numbers for some of these elements. There's no, as I said, there's no significant change in the NFF factor rate values anticipated other than those related to wrapping in of grant funding. So there may be some increase around inflation and pay, not expecting that to be huge. There will be the wrapping in of the grant funding, so the National Insurance Contributions Grant and the, what are they calling it this year? School Budget Grant, SBSG, can't remember what it stands for, but the two grants that you're receiving this year in addition, those will be wrapped into the schools block formula for next year, likely in a similar way to they've wrapped in the grants over the last few years. There is the DfE haven't yet announced, so there are some. There is an element in those grants that gives additional funding to schools with resource provisions. That bit won't be wrapped into the schools block, but they haven't yet announced whether that will remain a separate grant or whether it will be some kind of wrapping into high needs block baselines or top up calculations. So we will wait to hear on that bit, but we know that the mainstream element of the grants will be rolled in. One of the things that is upcoming, but is we now know is not going to impact 26-27, is there's going to be a change to the IDARCI, so the income deprivation affecting children index is updated every 5 years, and the last time that was updated, it changed the proportions of areas that were deprived to shift away from London. So a higher proportion of the more deprived areas were elsewhere in the country apart from London. And the expectation is that the refresh will follow that pattern again. So what it could mean is that it has an impact on the amount of funding that comes through those factors for London schools. Moving forward, it was possible that could have impacted the 26-27 allocations, but the government have now confirmed that those allocations will be based on the current IDARCI. So that's something to note for the following year, that could have an impact. And the thing it might impact is the number of schools that are affected by the minimum funding guarantee potentially, let's say something for next year. Our model continues to substantially mirror the national funding formula in 25-26, and the way the formula is now, we would need to continue to substantially mirror it. There are a small number of adjustments for affordability, and those have been similar the last few years. We would expect similar adjustments to be required in this year, and there could potentially be further adjustments needed, but we're not expecting any significant changes. So expecting it to possibly be similar adjustments. So those are the kind of the principles around some of those things around minimum funding guarantee. Will be some of the things we'll be consulting on in the autumn term. Other bits around there, so premises existing arrangements with PFI factors likely to remain, which is current plus inflation. Split site continue to be on a formula basis, probably similar with possibly a slight uplift. Growth and falling role funding. So again, we're expecting the mechanism around that to be the same this year. We've seen a reduction in growth funding over the last few years, and with sort of falling roles and now impacting into the secondary sector again, we expect again that part of the block is going to decrease. But we're also seeing less pressures, particularly as some more vacancies open up in the secondary sector. So would hope that would largely offset. Around the minimum funding guarantee, the decision, in principle decision, we would suggest consulting on would be around funding the minimum allowable, so keeping the formula as close to the schools funding as close to the national funding formula as possible. Last year there was some that minimum funding guarantee ended up being a minus number last year, so it was minus 0.5. We anticipate it might be again as the government sort of pushed to move local authorities and schools closer towards the national funding formula. So before we move on to some of the other block bits, it might just be worth pausing and picking up any questions on that now.
Any questions on the dedicated schools grant funding decisions to this point?
I suppose just strategically taking a step back, is it overall, are we kind of comfortable with all these things are heading? Because it's quite complicated technical metrics that are being applied here. Overall, are we in a good shape? It's very hard for me to interpret what this means. And tomorrow?
Yeah, so I think the principle that Forum have followed previously is that, as Kim mentioned, is an appetite to remain as close as the national funding formula as is affordable. So the only reason why we aren't exactly at the national funding formula is because of overall affordability, and that's to do with the kind of the demographics of the cohort and the lagged nature of funding. And so essentially what we're checking in with Forum around is whether we're content to continue on that basis, because that will help inform the consultation document that we draft. If there are any material changes, it's helpful to know in advance, because we need to begin to model that and think about how we consult with schools more broadly. The rationale behind the decision to remain close to the national funding formula was that is the general direction of travel. Ealing as a local authority, which had directed significant amounts of funding through to disadvantaged groups, were already broadly in line with the national funding formula, and that moving further away from the national funding formula could at some stage create a cliff edge in the future. And so that was the broad rationale. So in terms of what Kim has set out, really today, there aren't any decisions today, but it's broadly to understand if Forum and kind of schools more broadly would want to consider an alternative to that approach. We haven't had any indications at this stage that that's the case, but we like to check in the summer, and that's the next few recommendations are on a similar vein, because it can take quite some time to then model and implement some more material changes. So it's good to have a heads up in the summer term.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? So just so I understand, when you're saying follow the national, this is to protect all the schools so that they have certainty. But for the local authority, for the council itself, we're subject to what the national formula spits out, I guess, in terms of money. So that was really my question. What's the risk that we've distributed the money and then the actual national formula gives us a completely different sum of money and we have a deficit of some sort?
So there isn't a risk of the LA having less money than it's allocated out to schools unless we make a material mistake. And there are a range of checks and balances to prevent that from happening. And part of the reason why some of the formula factors are not quite at the national funding formula rate is because of exactly what you've mentioned. The overall pot to the council doesn't quite allow us to fund at the national funding formula rate. That's the nature of kind of lagged funding and demographics changing and the funding being cut at a point in time rather than it being intentionally kind of more or less than what the funding formula should allow for.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions to this point? I've got some, if nobody else has any yet.
Just before, so I think your questions relate to the do they relate to the central services blocks and the delegation educational functions?
One of them is.
Okay, so I was just saying, I mean, the rest of this, so if I just finish this bit and then we'll come to those then.
Cool.
So the other elements that we forum are required to vote on are around a range of dedelegated and central budget line by line allocation of central budgets line by lines in the meeting. So decisions for either the November or January meeting, we usually try to get as much of these decisions over the line in the November meeting as we can. So it's seeking feedback on whether forum are minded to continue to fund those services, and any initial thoughts around the funding allocations for education functions, DDEL, central school services, sports and retained duties, and around the sort of expected continued reduction of the historic commitments. So the budgets for last year are set out in appendix, what we're on for. And yeah, so any kind of comments or initial thoughts around that?
John?
Thanks, Jeremy. With the consultation underway for the Catholic schools to academise, what's the likely impact to be on the DSG budgets and how are we going to mitigate that?
Tomorrow?
So all the elements of funding which are based on pupil numbers at maintained schools, so not academies, will be reduced proportionately based on that. And so part of the work of the local authority would be to move towards a traded model where that's something that the Catholic schools want to opt into, and where that is either kind of not an option or not something that they want to opt into. We will need to think about how we contain the impact of that reduction in budget as part of our budget setting, and so that will be part of what we'll consult on. Generally speaking, we try to contain increased. Essentially, we have core costs that we need to manage, and the budget will come down. So we'll need to think about how we manage that. Local authority side, if there are areas where there are kind of material pinch points around that, that's something that we'd need to consult on at the time. So, for example, free school eligibility checking cost doesn't proportionately reduce based on that, and so we need to think about the operating model for that, and if we can marginally reduce spend, we will. But if we have a core cost element that we can't adjust down, we'd need to think about what we consult on that value being as part of the delegation decisions coming up. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so all those dedelegations are then have a traded for academies. They're offered as a buyback service for them. So, for example, the free school meal eligibility currently has full buy-in from the academies at the same kind of rate that maintained schools do. So it doesn't necessarily mean if schools move into an academy that the income would reduce, but the central bit that's guaranteed reduces. And then for some of the education functions areas, there would be proportionate kind of reduction and without a kind of buyback element to it.
Yeah, presumably that doesn't relate to trade union times, which wouldn't be often a buyback kind of way.
So the trade union times are something that academies buy into. I think the majority of academies also, again, at the kind of same rate that maintains. At the same rate that maintained schools are top sliced, the academies do are offered, and many do buy into the trade union time.
Thank you. Can you remind me of the timescales now and what the kind of the milestones are for getting to the decision point for this, so we're aware of what the services are likely to have in terms of budgets?
Yeah, so we will be drafting the consultation document over the summer, and so that's why we asked this question, because it will inform the content of it. The consultation will be open probably through mid-September towards the end of October for schools to comment. We would take decisions where possible, where School Forum feels ready to make those decisions in November. If any decisions aren't able to be made in November, they come to the January forum, and then the implementation would be from the 1st of April. If there was an indication, perhaps, so for example, a number of years ago, the high schools decided that they wanted to move to a traded model for behaviour support services. And so that meant that we needed to reorganise within the local authority. Some of that work would start at an earlier stage, which again is why we ask particularly for more material changes to kind of schools' intentions around what is provided centrally as opposed to what would be traded or not provided at all. So that's broadly the outline timescale.
Okay, John. Anything else? Okay, I've got 4 bits. The first one, I'd like to, we're moving into some uncharted territory here, as John's pointed out eloquently to us, and I think that coupled with the great success of ELP and the traded services we have, it's created a gray space in some of this, and I think that it's really important moving forward we understand what is a buyback, what is a top slice, and what is ELP, because all of those things serve a function, often different functions, but in really simple budget lines, they're undecipherable. And the average head teacher could not unpick these sorts of things. And I spent a good 90 minutes today trying to do that myself and came to a number of roadblocks where I thought, well, actually, I don't know where that comes from and who's paying for this or for that. So it would be helpful if at the next meeting that we had a bit of a breakdown here of what are the, under education functions, which is for maintained schools, thinking about things like the impact that John's talking about, but also what are the statutory and regulatory duties that are costing us £760,000, and what are the core school improvement functions that are costing £260,000? And I think that positioning this alongside the buybacks and the ELP services, I think would be helpful for schools and would be helpful for forum members who are making decisions about whether or not this is the direction of travel we want to go. So that's the first one. I'm happy for you to respond one by one if you like.
Yeah, so absolutely. So some of that will be picked up in the consultation document. So you should see that in there. There's usually an appendix which sets out some of the detail around what those blocks are their intended purposes, which clarifies to some extent what you're describing, and we can add some additional information in there. What we are mindful of in producing information for forum is that some of this relates to specific individuals and their roles, and so the level of information provided in the public document we just need to be mindful of, but we can provide a description and a kind of broad explanation about what that funds. For the learning partnership elements, running concurrently, we're moving into a new strategic period and there's a lot of scrutiny around budget and the split. Equally, learning partnership subscribers wanting to be clear for the same reason, and so there's already quite a lot of detail around that split, the split of roles, the split of functions, and so we can surface and further clarify that through this process. And if there are any points of clarification remaining at the point we bring anything in November, there's still time to add additional clarification for a January decision if forum requires additional assurance around that.
Great. And it has gotten much better. So I'll start with that. But the survey is still written in terms that are difficult for the average head teacher to unpick in terms of their relationship between their answers and the direction of travel of the money in the local authority. Is there opportunity for this survey to be designed in partnership with head teachers who understand some of these things to be helpful in translations, or are the timelines too short?
So in short, yes. we'll be drafting it over the next month or so, but clearly it's the holidays, and so we're not expecting schools forum members to contribute to that. But what you have is last year's, and so if you have comments on last year's survey, because substantially it's carried forward, there were quite similar questions in there. I think if you have feedback associated with that, that would be useful to provide at this stage.
Your word version.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we can also do at the beginning of term, which we completely understand is a very busy period for you, but there'll be a couple of weeks at the beginning of the autumn term where we can share the proposed document that will actually be going out for. And if there's if any of you have any time or inclination, you're more than welcome to provide comments, and we can attempt to include those as well. I think it's inevitable that there will be some technical elements to it. The questions we generally try to stick to broad principles, and we can have a think about the level of technical information that is necessary to demonstrate that we've fully consulted, and perhaps think about streamlining that a little bit.
I mean, I don't want to be sorry.
I mean, the other thing we do each autumn is put on or offer a chance for head teacher or other colleagues to come and talk through the consultation. We've only had a small number of schools take up that, and I know everyone's busy in the autumn term, but if there are, that's the sort of opportunity. If there are head teachers who need kind of guiding through the documents, so we'll continue to offer those in the autumn term for any head teachers who
as I said, this is not, I think that the survey itself has improved. It's not at all a comment on you guys do an incredible job. I just think, you know, the average head teacher has not taken any course whatsoever in finance, and these are big decisions and the changing landscape. My other question then was, these do not need to be, maybe some of this is just, I want to just plant it and then we can decide what you'd like to do with it, or nothing. The IDACI changes, I just am a little bit worried in Ealing specifically with the Elizabeth line. There's been a ton of new build, which is changing school demographics quite substantially. And I'm just wondering if we have pre-identified schools like Three Bridges, who were once 55% pupil premium with, you know, 8th highest IDACI score in Ealing, who will very soon be the Montpelier of Southall, with a very changing demographic. Are we identifying those schools and communicating with them so they know to expect this IDACI change, which also will equate to quite a substantial, not only change in their pupil premium budget, which they can probably predict, but this is going to be a little bit grayer. Are we communicating with them? You don't need to answer it right now. I just am planting because I'm just mindful of time. The other thing was just around, I get very nervous when the government says we're rolling it into the national funding formula, because then I just get an amount of money. When I get a grant, I know that it's bolted on top of what I get. And is it actually being rolled in? Do you know that it's been rolled in? Can you see the figure? And if you can that be in the budget documents you give us, like outlined, like, look, they did actually give you this, or you're getting, I won't use the word. So is that possible to show schools that the roll-in is actually happening or not?
Yeah, so it's possible to. They are rolling it in. There is an element being added to the fact they are rolling it in. But yes, we can set that up.
And then the other thing was just around the last thing was just around de-delegated budgets. I spoke offline to some members last time, but I just wanted to put it out there. I'm wondering if it's possible for secondary members in the autumn meeting to, between now and then, consider the trade union facility time differential between secondary and primary, because I understand historically there were reasons that those decisions were taken. And I'm wondering if in the 25-26 year, some of the reasons those decisions were taken are changing. And if they're changing, that maybe this is a time to reconsider the way we fund those services for members that are in secondary. It's not at all to cause combat. It's just to plant a seed and say, is that something people are willing to have a conversation about it at secondary? Those were my 4 things. Jamie?
We on? Yeah, just a really quick point talking about the inaccessibility, can I call it that, of the questionnaire. What I've started doing at my school is videos, because no one reads anything, and I do a video. So I'm just wondering if we could have like a video, like this question means this question means this, and people could watch like a 5-minute video to get the gist of it, because that seems to be the way things are going. No one reads anything anymore. It might be a good suggestion to increase the uptake of people answering correctly.
I think the noise that I just heard coming from my right was a resounding yes, Jamie. I think that was what that meant. Am I translating that correctly? Or is that Canadian, British to Canadian?
We've got to get comfortable being, you know, being on video.
Are there any other questions or comments before we move towards the end? No. Kim?
So then some other elements around for the other blocks moving into next financial year. So recommendation 6 is just a note and update on early years, the rollout of extended entitlements and the sort of funding formula issues for 26-27. I've already touched on a few of these in terms of the change to the way we'll be funded, and that's something we're working to understand the impact on. I don't think I need to go through the detail of that section, so it's set out on page 21. But if there are any particular questions on that, pick up. It's just an item for noting.
Anything at all? Online? No. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to recommendation 7, which is to note an update on high needs funding pressures and provide feedback on continuing the 0.5% transfer from the schools block to the high needs block. So we've already kind of set out the deficit position. So the overall deficit on the high needs block is 7.7 million at the end of 24-25. Overall DSG is 5.7 million when you take into account the offset of the SEPs in the early years block. We provided a detailed update at the April meeting around the high needs recovery plan, so the DSG management plan. So won't go into the detail of that again, but so this is just an item for kind of for noting and asking for any views around the whether for a reminder to continue the 0.5% transfer. So it was 1.65 million in 25-26, with the wrapping in of grant funding and some possible small increases in the block. That's probably going to be something in the region of 1.7 million in 26-27 if we continued with the 0.5%.
Thanks, Kim. I think this was covered quite thoroughly by Aretha in April. If you have any further comments on that, Ian?
My feeling is that we've seen the numbers. It's clearly the biggest pressure point for us. I think anything that reduced that 0.5 would be working adversely, and so I would be very supportive of continuing it as it is.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to note that the 0.5% is a continuation of what's been agreed in previous years. So it's not an additional funding, it's not cumulative, it's a 0.5% of the block continuing.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Ian. Great. Last one. Home stretch.
Okay, and the last item is, again, just an item for noting. So we thought it would be helpful to include a little bit of information on this in the forum report. So to note an update on free school meal eligibility and potential funding implications. So in June 25, government announced the extension of means tested free school meals to all children in households in receipt of universal credit. So from September 26, that should say. So it's not 25, it's September 26. So there's a lead in time for that. Not overly helpful for government to announce it with that level of lead in time, because we've had a massive increase in queries to the free school the team around that entitlement that doesn't actually come in until September 26. So that's going to be coupled at the same time with the ending of transitional protection. So there was a previously transitional protection was due to end in this March, and then children would continue to be protected until the end of their phase. That's now completely changed. Transitional protection is in place until next summer, so until summer 26, but then it ends at that point at the same time as the extension of the new entitlement. So the expectation is that a large amount of those children that are covered only because of protection at the moment would actually meet the new entitlement, but there's still quite a bit of uncertainty around what the net off between those groups is and what the financial impact therefore is. The government have said that the new entitlement will be fully funded, but details will come in due course. So the intention, if there's a net increase in numbers entitled to free school meal, would be there'd be additional funding for schools to reflect that. They've said it won't be wrapped into the 26-27 funding formula, so it won't be part of the schools block. It will be additional funding. But as I say, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty about whether that there will actually be a net increase because of the size of the number of children that are only covered by transitional protection. So around a third of the children currently eligible for free school meals would not be eligible based on their current circumstances. They are only covered because of transitional protection. As I say, a large amount of those are likely to be entitled under the new entitlements, but the actual impact of that's not yet clear. The one thing the government have said to date is that pupil premium funding would continue to be based on the existing threshold. So there wouldn't be a large increase in pupil premium funding relating to that. Children who are covered by transitional protection, though, would, under the current pupil premium, as the definition the allocation doesn't change, continue to remain eligible for 6 years after the ending of their entitlement. So we're not expecting any significant impact on the funding. The only element of the formula that's based on the actual current entitlement is the bit that's effectively an in and out, so the bit that largely funds the meal cost. So we're not expecting it to have a significant impact. So we're just kind of flagging that for information at this stage.
Jamie?
Just for clarification, so basically it won't affect primary schools because of the mayoral infant, junior, universal free school meals. It seems to be only affecting high schools.
So it would, at the moment, the universal infant free school meal and the grant that primary schools get for the mayoral meals only covers the children that aren't eligible for the benefit related bit, and the benefit income related bit is then funded through the formula. So if there was a increase in numbers eligible for the income benefit related bit, you would just see a corresponding decrease in your grant value. So yes, the net off.
But yeah, in real terms for a primary school, we won't see any difference. It's the secondary schools
would largely net off. There could still be, so it would largely net off for primary school because of the way you carry the rates of funding through the funding formula for benefit related children are slightly higher, but yeah, it would largely net off. Secondary schools, if there is an increase, could see a lag period where they're having to fund more meal costs for a higher number of children. But as I say, because transitional protection is ending at the same time, like actually the difference, the net difference may not be as significant as the government have suggested in their estimates of 500,000 additional children being eligible.
Thank you.
Councillor?
Yeah, just a quick, I should have asked this in the clarification. The nursery schools and free school meals, is that what happens with nursery schools in terms of?
So most children in nursery aren't entitled to free school meals because they where they only attend for half a day, they wouldn't then be entitled for a free school meal. Where you have children who are attending for a full day and receiving, I think, education both morning and afternoon, a small number of those children can then be eligible for free school meals. There isn't additional funding for that, so that then just wrapped up in the funding that schools receive through the 3 and 4 year old funding. But yeah, you wouldn't expect to see a significant impact.
There is a deprivation fund though for the early years.
Within the early years funding formula, there is deprivation elements to that. So schools that would have a high rate of deprivation, and so would be more likely to have children who were entitled to free school meals, do receive a higher funding through the formula.
Any other questions or comments? Wonderful. Kim, are you feeling exhausted? Wonderful. Well, that will bring the summer meeting of the Schools Forum 2025 to a close. Let me just say thank you so much to everyone who's here, everyone who's online. The conversation, the discussion, the commentary that exists in this space, I think is always really powerful. And I'm really glad that we can, I'm really hopeful we can keep it that way as we move into the autumn, where we've clearly got some, challenging conversations to have. So have a lovely summer if we don't see you again.
Do we tell the date of the next meeting?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry?
Okay. we're happy to
Excuse me, please check the online meeting program for the date of the next meeting. It's online.
Thank you. Have a lovely summer. Thank you so much.
Bye all. Thank you.